Good morning. It's Monday today, almost forgot, and welcome to Saba's Way of Life. Today I'm going to continue with the kind of mini series on cancer. This is the fourth video on this subject, and remember, I'm talking about it from a very holistic perspective. And those of you who haven't listened or watched the last three, you would need to do that to make sense of what I'm about to talk to you about today. In fact, read from this book to you today. I'm going to be reading from The Healing Power of Illness. It's a book written by two men. One of them has now passed away. One of them is a psychologist, the other one was a psychotherapist and an esotericist, Austrian and German born, incredible people. The book was written actually in the late 80s, so not too long ago, but the authors themselves were older. They would have been in their 40s and 50s at that time. Incredible insight and very relevant to today. I also want to mention that the current political situation today, and I'm very interested in sociopolitics. I'm reading, I'm studying, I'm researching it a lot because it's linked to health, it's linked to our way of lives. It's important that we're aware of what's going on and that we increase our knowledge through our own individual, independent research outside of mainstream influence. And you will get to a stage eventually, like I did, and sometimes it's years in the making, whereby I am able to watch something, let's say the mainstream news, which for me is alien, but I'm not absorbed by it at all. I hope many of you are not who are watching this, but none of it sinks into my brain in a way that it's supposed to mind control me. I can just look at it from an eagle's perspective and laugh and look around and see how easily the masses are duped into believing this nonsense. And the same goes with everything on your phone, on your devices, your education system, all of it. This is a system that is governed by the laws of Satan, and it has been very, very intelligently articulated and planned over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And once your eyes open, you can see it. And for me, the way my eyes opened was over a period of years, and the fact that I didn't switch on the TV, the media, I just switched it all off. I've always been what these authors call a refusenik, a dissident, divergent, always. And and that's a positive thing. In fact, even in the Quran, which I've relatively recently found in the metaphoric way, it says very clearly in there, God says, the majority are always wrong. It will only be the minority. So when you feel something and you know something isn't right, it takes great courage to go against the grain of the majority. And I'm talking about anything. I'm talking about religion, the way it's turned into a cult. I'm talking about your education system. I'm talking about your upbringing. I'm talking about everything, absolutely everything. Although my passion is more on the health side, politics and health and education, all of it, everything is linked. We talked about the whole, and the more you watch this channel and my talks, hopefully your mind will start to realize and recognize this, and you'll start to grasp your own inner power and feel compelled and encouraged to start thinking for yourself. I can safely say to you that the opposite of everything we've been taught is true. The polar opposite. Polar opposite. So now let me get back to what this is supposed to be about, but it's all connected. So in the last video, in Cancer 3, the authors talked about the socio-political situation to try to help you understand how the whole works, how the state works, and how a small group who do not follow what the state is saying. Remember not to assume in your mind it means A, B, C. Just hear what I'm saying, and then afterwards you can think about it in different ways. So a small amount of what they call refuseniks in the book, but dissidents or divergents that do not want to follow the state or the crowd, can have a catastrophic effect on the whole if they continue. You have to go back to Cancer 3 and listen to that. And now I'm going to continue with the reading, with the book. So here we go. Just going to reread the last couple of lines I read from the last Cancer 3 video. So the authors say, in no way is it the purpose of these few lines relating to Cancer 3 to develop any kind of political or social theory or creed. Rather is it to represent what happens in cancer in a very different context, so as to broaden somewhat people's normally extremely blinkered view of the disease. So let's continue. Cancer is not an isolated occurrence whose sole manifestation is the illness that it is so called. Rather, are we confronted in cancer with a very sophisticated and intelligent process, which is of equal concern to us on every other level too. In virtually every other illness, we find the body trying to get rid of whatever the problem is, whatever the problem that's jeopardizing its function, by applying suitable countermeasures. So remember, in every other illness, we're trying to get rid of whatever the disease is in the body by understanding the symptoms and then using some form of medication. We're not talking about what form here, just some form of medication to get rid of the illness, right? And if it succeeds in this, we speak of healing, which can be either more or less total. If it fails and goes under in the attempt, we call the result death. So this is relevant in all other diseases except cancer. Now the authors are going to explain what's different about cancer. In the cancer process, however, we are faced with something fundamentally different. The body merely looks on as more and more of its own cells, the body's own cells, change their behavior and begin a process of regular division, which has no end in itself, but merely finds its ultimate term in the exhaustion of the host that is its food source. Do you understand this? So what it's saying, just to explain, is that the difference in cancer is very different, where the cells start changing their own behavior. So the body's own cells start changing their own behavior, and it just grows, and through division, it grows and grows and grows. So the cancer cell itself is not the actual threat to the organism, to the body, to our body, in the same way that bacteria is. I'm going to move on and talk about that in a minute, but actually I've moved on too much. Let me just go back a little bit. So what it's saying here is that eventually, as the cells change their behavior and they keep dividing, eventually what happens is the ultimate term, the end, is the end of the food source, which is the organism. You are the food source, and you become exhausted. So not only does the cancer cell die, it dies because the host, its food source, dies. So they both die. And I can't help but relate this to what's happening politically today. I'm sure many of you who are aware can too. The whole idea of everything imploding in on itself. Implosion is what comes to mind. Now let's move on. The cancer cell is not some external threat to the organism in the way that bacteria, viruses, or toxins are. For example, instead, it is a cell that has hitherto devoted all its activity to the service of the organ in question, and thus to that of the organism as a whole, so as best to promote its prospects of survival. Now I'm going to just repeat that. This is important here. The cancer cell is not some external threat to the organism. It's not coming to threaten the organism externally. It's not something from outside that's coming in like bacteria does, toxins do, viruses do. So it's a cell that the cancer cell devotes its entire being to the organism it's in. So for anyone you know who's got cancer, that cell has devoted itself to that person. I want you to really think about this, and it's in service to that person, and thus to the organism. So whether or not that cancer is affected in, let's say, breast cancer, that's irrelevant. It's actually devoted itself to the entire body, all the organs. Now, remember this. Devoted all of its activity to the service of the organ in question, and thus to the organism as a whole, because it wants to protect and promote its best interest, because it needs to survive. Now, what happens then, as the authors say, yet suddenly it changes its mind. It changes its mind and abandons the common identification. Then it starts to develop its own aims, and it puts its own aims into effect, regardless of anything else. It ceases to perform what hitherto has been a specific organic role, and it makes its own reproduction its first and only priority. So now it no longer behaves as a member of a multicellular life form, but regresses to an evolutionary, more primitive form of existence as a single-celled organism. And then they beautifully relate this to this cancer cell terminating its membership of the Union of Cellular Workers. And thanks to its chaotic process of cell division, it goes on to spread itself abroad with great rapidity and ruthlessness, ignoring all morphological boundaries, which is infiltration, and establishing footholds all over the body. And that's known in cancer as metastasis, when the formation of metastasis. It uses what is left of the community from which its behavior has expelled it as a host for feeding on. Now, you need to really understand how cancer works and how it's only able to do this if it is taken over the mind of its host. you would also, for those of you who've been watching from the beginning and understanding a little bit about my background, how I think and what I'm talking about to you, you would also be able to relate this to the words of God and to scripture and to how Satan conducts himself. In fact, everything I've just read is an absolute metaphor and a parallel to how the elite are working humanity to their own interests and ends. It's an incredible metaphor, and when you look at it in a lesser form, that's exactly what's happening in your body when you have cancer. I'm just going to move on and just read the last bit here. So it uses what is left of the community from which its behaviour has expelled it as a host for feeding on. The cancer cells grow and multiply so quickly that the blood vessels are unable to maintain an adequate blood supply. And so the cancer cells switch from oxygen breathing to the more primitive process of fermentation. And breathing is dependent on community for exchange. Community, nature, birds and bees, plants, carbon, everything. We need it all, CO2. Breathing is dependent on community, on exchange. Fermentation is something that any cell can do for itself. Oh, goodness me. There are so many analogies in this part of the reading, and I really would like you to go back and listen to it again. And I would recommend that you get this book if you can. I did check on eBay and it is still available. So please get it before it disappears, because it is fantastic. The whole book, I'm only reading a tiny section. The first part of it, the first half, is eye-opening spiritually. So that is Cancer 4. It's explaining how that system of works in the body, of the dissident divergent against the whole organism. You have to work out in cancer who is what, who the whole is, who the state is, who the dissident is, who's the divergent. It could be the opposite way around, but it's actually the system. You need to understand how the system works. It's all a system. And when your mind starts to understand the system in which we're living in, the system in which the body works as a whole, you'll start to twig. This is stuff that we should be taught at school from when we are very young. If we are deliberately kept away from understanding how the system works as a whole. And for some time I studied Ayurveda, and those of you who understand, it's an ancient 5,000-year-old way of healing, but actually it's not the most ancient. Before that was something called Siddha, and in the Islamic culture they call it Hikmat, Hakims, but Siddha always worked, and even Ayurveda to some degree, which I believe was evolved over time, but was more of a Western frequency that came in to create Ayurveda. But that worked in a very metaphysical and spiritual fashion, but also a very organized scientific fashion to heal the body as a whole. It's magical. That's enough for today. Have a lovely Monday, and hopefully I will do another video tomorrow.